Yes, gracias, Enrique. Very thankful for the opportunity to talk today. I've talked to Enrique a number of times, and I'm very grateful for the possibility of sharing and raising awareness for some of these issues, which have been particularly difficult to raise awareness in regards to my country. I'm a Venezuelan clinical community psychologist. I am now living in Spain, but continue to do research and to teach at Venezuela online. And for a while, I've been being able to have some inventory and register some of the psychiatric abuse and the use of psychiatry for political repression in Venezuela. And it's been quite hard to position the issue, even though some of the actions are quite public. And so again, it's a great possibility to be able to share with others that are doing similar work in other areas of the world. I'm going to show some slides to be able to share my presentation. Just a second here. Okay. So you should be able to see my slides now. I just want to see if I can see myself and the slides at the same time. Okay. Okay, so you should be seeing my slides now, and I want to start showing a little bit of the context of the psychiatric situation in Venezuela before going through some of the specific cases of use of psychiatry for political repression. Um, and there was a very particular experience last year as I was teaching to the course in one of the postgraduate courses that seems very illustrative, very representative of some of the things that are going on. And that's kind of where the name of the presentation comes from. It's not metaphoric, it's quite literal. Um, I was teaching one of the courses where we discuss some of the psychiatric users movements and some of the story of anti-psychiatric movements and the development of psychiatric models for attention. And as I was going through the Twitter before that class, I came up with a quite astounding tweet that I found where some clinical resident mentioned that as he was doing his clinical practice in a public psychiatric hospital, he came one morning and to find that the whole hospital was filled with pigs in the hospital, and it was just one more of a huge layer of examples of the abandonment of the level of abandonment of the psychiatric clinics. And he took some pictures and videos, and he tweeted them, as I said, with anonymously. So here is, I think you can see my second uh, um, um, the second slide. Please let me know if the second slide came up. Here is some of the pictures that the student shared, and as I say, they were quite surprising. So I took them to class next day to kind of to show that this was another example of the level of a deterioration of the system. Okay, perfect, Henrik. Um, to my surprise, at the end of the class, a student asked to talk to me, and I said, of course. And we talked through WhatsApp, and she said that she wanted to talk to me because the person who had done those tweets was at that class that day, and was feeling very scared and wanted to talk to me in private, but didn't know if it was safe to do so. So I was kind of surprised by this whole affair. I haven't been in Venezuela living for 5 years, so the level of fear in him kind of surprised me. But of course, I said yes. And when he talked to me, I was able to understand a bit more. He said that his tweet had become viral inside of the country, and newspaper sources had picked up on the news, and well, one of the pictures there is from one of those portals, and that made an alarm go off in the psychological school in our university, and some university figures had told them that it was not right to have uh, done that tweet, and that he should take it down because he put the university's practice at that hospital at risk, and it might not be ethical to be doing this. And I was kind of surprised by the whole thing, because not only was it surprising to see the what was going on in the hospital, it was also surprising to see the university's reaction, first of so much fear, and second to be even suggesting to censor his critique, his public critique. But that also led me to understand the level of militarization and authoritative use of the public spaces in general, which I think is very relevant to all of things I want to share in this talk today. I'll talk also around 30 minutes, and try to have some time to talk with any question and share any questions and comments. So, in the context of what's going on in psychiatry in Venezuela, has to do with a collapse of the public health system in general, and specifically in the public psychiatric system, which has very gravely deteriorated. The government does not share its data on public health since around 2011. But we can have some sources of how bad the situation has gotten from different sources. The World Health Organization cited the government in 2011, showing the number of service users of the public psychiatric system, and showed how that meant that there was already a 42% reduction of the availability of beds for chronic or acute patients that needed to be hospitalized. And in 2015, a New York Times report found figures to be of 5,558 service users. So if in 2011 there was a 42% reduction, having 37,000 patients, we can see that by 2015 the lack of services provided is astoundingly low, and that is what we confirm through our daily practice. I mean, with all the residents and all the doctors that we know in the public health system, we know that there's a lack of medicines, many times using medicines that have already passed their date, and general conditions in many cases. And there's not even food in some of these public hospitals. And in one particular surprising account by the students that were doing their practice in one of these hospitals, they even told us that there weren't any chairs. They were doing their theoretical and practical seminars of the university sitting on the floor, which is surprising because yeah, the chairs used to be at the hospital. So it's not they didn't have resources, somebody stole the chairs, and there were any chairs anymore. So we're talking about a huge collapse of what was before a regularly working system, not the best system, but reasonably functioning, to a very deteriorated situation, and reflected in different ways in the suffering of the people who are supposed to be receiving help. Um, in a newspaper report that went through one of the public hospitals of chronic patients, I extracted this quote, which I think is very significant, of a patient saying, "I'm not crazy, I'm hungry," and having many reports of patients who were abandoned in these public hospitals, not only feeling hunger, finally having patients die of hunger. And it's pretty incredible to imagine patients dying of hunger while being hospitalized in a public service. So this amount of of scarcity led to, in 2019, the unofficial shutdown of services. We know this because the directors of services and the doctors that are friends told us that they received the information, not written but orally, to not receive any more patients and to try to gradually send all the patients that were there back to their homes. And for a couple of years, there was practically no access to public psychiatric services in the country. Uh, the lack of psychiatric medicine is one part. There's also a lack of any type of medicines, and we have reports of patients that died because they got an infection and there weren't even antibiotics, and that led to the spreading of the infection and the death of the patient. So in more official reports about the situation, for example, WOLA, which is the Washington Office of Latin America, that did an analysis of Venezuela's complex humanitarian crisis, clearly states that the health system is in shambles, and I'd say the psychiatric system is probably the worst off. And we also have the possibility of that newspaper reports have shown a bit of what's going on, and even international sources, the international reports have shown a bit of what's going on inside of psychiatric hospitals. Washington Post, New York Times, El País in Spain, and we get a glimpse of the gravity of the general situation. 2 years ago, I was able to conduct a research project with one of the news portals that is independent researching in Venezuela, and through them, we were able to call the list of the mental health services listed by the Ministry of Health, and call at different times of day to see how many were functioning. And during 3 months of calling these 264 centers, we were able to receive 4% of answers. Only 4% of those centers answered the call, and 2% of them stated that they were offering attention. So again, another example of the grave limitations of access to services in Venezuela. This is in contrast to a system that had been growing and that had been developing since the 50s. It had maybe 3, 4 decades that, with difficulties, had been able to grow and to even improve in regards to awareness of patients' human rights, of developing more modern approaches to mental health. For example, one of the public hospitals that was shut down, which is this picture here, Hospital Psiquiátrico El Peñón, was a hospital that was opened in 1962 in the beginning of kind of the mental health revolution, of thinking of more humane ways of offering psychiatric treatment. It was designed with wide open spaces. It had community activities. It thought that helping, having a very comfortable and active participation of the inpatients would be good for their health. And it was part of the movement that happened in Venezuela and in the world to strive for brief hospitalizations only in the acute moments of a crisis. And it helped to lead some of these transformations in the psychiatric system in Venezuela, as it became part of a movement for reform that was very strong in the 80s, that was fed from many things that were happening in the world. And in 1980, in 1990, we in Caracas, the capital of Venezuela, we even hosted one of the emblematic conferences on the rethinking of psychiatric practices. And this conference for restructuring psychiatric care in Latin America led to what is known as the Declaration of Caracas, where many countries of the World Health Organization, through their psychiatric departments, agreed on striving to develop a more community-based and more human rights aware types of treatment for psychiatric patients. So I'm mentioning this because this is, I think, important to understand what's gone on in Venezuela in the last 2 decades, and how it contrasts to a system that had its faults, its many faults, but had been having some interesting advances in mental health care. And in a 2018 article by an academic who has thought about what the development of the psychiatric system says about the history of the whole country, he described it as a demodernization that would happen in mental health. Is described by him as demodernization, and he describes it as a retreat to pre-scientific 19th century psychiatry. As we see some of the pictures that have been reported in these international photographic reports, we see that the conditions of some of these patients are images that lead us more to think about 19th century psychiatry than 20th century psychiatry. And it's in this context of a system that has very gravely deteriorated, that the persecution of political dissidents through psychiatry has happened. So we have, so I'm presenting kind of two dramas that are related. One is a drama of the whole system for mental health care and what it has implied for those living with any type of psychiatric difficulty, to a more perverse use of psychiatry to persecute now political dissidents. And I'm going to share a couple of examples in this regard. The most emblematic case that has happened in Venezuela is referred to Franklin Brito, which was in the country a quite present figure at one point, and whose political persecution gravely used psychiatry as the weapon to try to quiet him. So I'm going to say a couple of things about the case, and lead that to what that pertains to psychiatric institutions. Franklin Brito was a school teacher. He was a high school teacher, also with biology and an agronomer. And he, in his life, what he was dedicated to was teaching in the high school of his town, but he also harvested his fields, and he, being an intelligent man, developed a strain of ñame. It's a root that is eaten in Venezuela, that he harvested without the use of fertilizers. So he found a way of harvesting this particular harvest without fertilizers, and that seemed to be a good thing. And he wrote to the local institution that helped fund much of what the agronomers were doing at the time, and showed that this could be harvested without fertilizers. And at that point, it was well received, and that led to funding his idea, and to stop funding the fertilizers used for that particular harvest in his area. And the dark side of this was that the local mayor was the one who handled the business of the fertilizers. So he started to try to quiet and to silence Franklin Brito. And he did this by two things. Franklin Brito was fired from his post as a high school teacher, and his lands were taken from him, and they were assigned to another local peasant. And the argument was used. The argument used was that it was part of the agrarian reform that was going on in this beginning of Chavismo as a more social, looking for equality government. But the fact was that the agrarian reform was meant to give lands that were not being cultivated, that were abandoned, that were not in use. And in fact, Franklin Brito's land was in use, and it was just using that to persecute him for having uh, made an obstacle to this mayor's business. So Franklin Brito began a series of protests to recover his land. He went to the different tribunals, to the different courts to make protest. Many of the courts told him that he was probably right in what he was doing, but they weren't going to go against a political figure. So he decided to start a number of hunger strikes. And that's when Franklin Brito becomes a national figure, and starts to news reports start to notice him. And he does a number of hunger strikes that begin to give him some political capital to challenge some of these abusive practice that these local governments and national governments was having with, for example, appropriation of land. And he starts to be a prominent figure and starts to become uncomfortable for national government that tries to bribe him, that tries to give him money, so he stops his protests. But they never accept officially giving him back his land. They say, we can give it back to you, but we can't sign any papers, we can't officially say we've made mistakes. And Franklin Brito very stubbornly said that he was only going to accept a legal resolution of his case. So that took around 7 years, leading up to the final hunger strike that he began in 2010 in front of the Organization of American States, which is international American governmental organization. And he had a very public hunger strike in front of those offices, and again was gaining a lot of visibility. And at that moment, what the government decided was to arrest him and hospitalize him, alleging that he was a psychiatric patient. So in 2010, at the beginning of 2010, he is taken to the military hospital, and he is given a psychiatric label, and they asked the psychiatry service to evaluate him. The psychiatry service at that public hospital evaluates him and comes to a conclusion that he does not have any psychiatric symptoms, but the court orders him to be hospitalized anyways. And so he ended up being hospitalized in the ophthalmology service because psychiatry wouldn't take him, but he was still taken in by the hospital. And we began a series of protests to try to make visible the use of psychiatry here to persecute Franklin Brito. And I remember when we talked to the doctors at the hospital, they were very scared. They mentioned that they strongly believed that he did not have any psychiatric illness, and that they were not agreeing with what they were being forced to do, but they weren't going to protest publicly. They were going to say that publicly. They were only going to say it privately. They were going to sign any report saying that he was ill, even though they were being kind of pressured to do so, but weren't going to do any public denouncement of the situation because they feared for their jobs, and worse, for possibly being also at risk. And so Franklin Brito spent 9 months in the public hospital. He was force fed at the beginning, he uh, he complained that he was being held in prison as a patient. Here's some of the extracts from some of the interviews that he gave at that moment. He said, for example, "I'm being held prisoner. I have three, no, two National Guards at my door. I am okay, but stuck here. They say I'm sick. I'm sick." Since they weren't able to make up any crime, they made up that I had to get well before I am free to leave. I will take this to the end for my family and my dignity. So, in this terrible situation, they evaluated him 9 times. The first eight evaluations came to the same conclusion, that he did not have any psychiatric symptoms, and only the ninth evaluation said that he was psychiatrically ill. It was done by a hospital director of another outside hospital, of a man who is clearly identified with the government, and is very vocal in his advocacy for the government. And this man was the only one that concluded that Franklin Brito had any psychiatric illness. And that led to the attorney general and to a national senator saying that Franklin Brito was crazy, and that all that had happened were only the reactions of a madman. And he was very publicly insulted in public declarations by government officials. As Franklin Brito saw that there was no end to this situation, he continued his hunger strike, and finally died after the 9 months in the hospital, which is again appalling, that someone who's supposedly been taken care of because he's taken to a public hospital dies while being at a public hospital. And I think this case is very significant for us, not only because it's a clear use of psychiatry to politically persecute a person, but also the difficulties for the organizations of psychiatrists, psychologists, to publicly denounce and to resist what was going on. There was a lot of efforts to resist, but not publicly. And I think this is very symptomatic of the fear of an authoritarian situation that is going on. It has to do with some of the other things that I'm going to mention. But this is not the only way there's been use of psychiatry to persecute. There's also been the invention of psychiatric labels in Venezuela. So, an ex minister of public health in Venezuela, Eric Rodriguez, he coined a term that he calls psychotic dissociation, and he wrote a manual, a book that he says to describe what he says is this condition that he discovered or invented, as you prefer. And they published this book by the Ministry of Communications. The cartoon at the front of the book is pretty telling of what he believes this psychiatric label to be, as he thinks that it is certain demonic qualities of television and of social media that gets into the heads of specifically the middle class. So he says this is a disorder suffered by the middle class, and it is a disorder of psychological manipulation done by television. This is particularly argument used in before the 2010, where the government still did not have control of most television channels. That is not the case now. So at that moment, the opposition to government was many times explained as a sort of psychotic dissociation created by manipulation. And his book is quite curious to read. It's a very pseudo-scientific jargon where he talks about a mix of things. He is not a psychiatrist and uses loosely many of the labels, but basically he's trying to say this, that opposition to the government is craziness, and we need to deal with people who are going crazy, saying that the revolution is abusive. For example, let me cite one of his paragraphs. He writes, "We try to understand this collective behavior defined as psychotic dissociation because of the presence of some components of this psychopathological trilogy: dissociation, psychosis, and disturbances of behavior. Based on the definition of this collective behavior, we proceeded to observe and analyze what the fundamental trigger that was affecting an important sector of Venezuelans of the middle class. And so this is kind of a pseudoscientific jargon, but it began to circulate and be constantly used as explanations and ways to disregard any arguments of the opposition and any, for example, challenges to human rights abuses that were being used to challenge government. And here's just a few examples as it began to circulate the label in different publications. Particularly worrying is the one on the left-hand side, which is a publication from the Journal of the University of the Andes, where someone very lightly the writes a public opinion article and uses the term to explain politically what is going on. But we have constant examples, and I found one even as recent as 2021, where the term was continued to be used. And we've had different versions of this, of the use of psychological terms and psychiatric terms to defend and use this propaganda by the government. Constantly before the international community finally identified Venezuela as a complex humanitarian crisis. Many government figures said it was just psychological warfare being held against Venezuela to undermine its marvelous achievements of the revolution. So constantly psychologizing and using psychological terms to explain away criticism. In 2017, an international forum was held in the Ministry of Interior, where they invited what they called experts on psychological warfare. And there was a meeting of experts and of government officials. When that was being promoted, that event, I knew of one of the psychologists who was in that team that was organizing that. And I told him, I am very keen to see the proof that you have, the evidence that you have, that the students that are on the streets protesting, it was a year of huge, massive student protest on the streets. I'm very keen to see what proof you have that these students that are protesting on the streets are manipulated psychologically and are not authentically in opposition to government. And he confessed that he didn't have any proof. He just had arguments of what he thought was manipulation. So I asked him if I could assist the forum, because it was such an important event that was talking about the explanation of what's going on in the protest. I wanted to hear the arguments and see what was going on. And he said that, of course, I would be offered an invitation. But finally, it was a closed event, and no one except those related were allowed to enter. At the end of this event, for example, Nicolas Maduro, the actual president of the present president of Venezuela, suggested that they needed to develop peace laboratories to be able to offer psychiatric treatment, to recuperate, to recover young student protesters who were really just mad and were having psychiatric difficulties, and that's why they needed psychiatric care. So once again, you see in different moments these arguments of psychiatric situations explaining away political dissidence is repeated. One of the main political figures right now, the president of the National Assembly, is a psychiatrist, and he had a television program, an online television program called Politics on the Couch, and he constantly used psychiatric terms to explain away any political oppositions. I have this quote. There are many from him. For example, psychosis is the opposition's disturbance, constantly using psychiatric terms to discredit any opposition. Another related case I'll just mention very briefly, because it gets quite bizarre as one gets into it. Hugo Chavez had a renowned psychiatrist who publicly said he was Chavez's psychiatrist, and Chavez's admitted that that was so. Finally, was found to have murdered a patient, and when they found the body and started to investigate in his consulting room, he was found to have 1,200 pictures of naked women in his consulting room. He was a serial rapist, and he had been able to do this because he was linked to power, and he was quite a public political psychiatric figure who was able to conduct a very perverse a terrible practice during years because of his links to power. So we're talking about here different versions of psychiatry interlinking with the power system. I imagine from the outside it's hard to understand such an intricate uh, 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 examples of psychiatry and power in Venezuela. But in the end, what I'm trying to point out is uh, that there has been systematic abuse of psychiatric language, of psychiatric infrastructure, of some psychiatrists to discredit opposition and sometimes to persecute opposition. And this has been very difficult to render visible in the midst of the economic crisis, in the midst of the political debates around Venezuela. The human rights of psychiatric patients has been very much not attended to. And the use of psychiatry for political reasons is something that even the professional organizations have tended to try to not confront. It's difficult to put on the table, to offer debate, and has been complicated to raise awareness. So let me try to close with a couple of comments my presentation. um, Let me mention just a couple of things about the reasons that for the collapse, and that I think that bring some arguments that are interesting to debate upon about psychiatry and political abuse. Um, of course, it's well, very obvious explanation is that we've gone through a huge economic crisis that has had Venezuela in the highest hyperinflation for a country in history of Latin America. A couple of years back, up to a couple of years back, of a very complex political crisis that's led to a terrible crisis of infrastructure. Well, that's a very general explanation, but more specifically, I want to mention one thing and leave that up to debate if we have a few minutes to talk. I think this relationship of psychiatry and political abuse, and listening to David Matas in the previous presentation, has a lot to do with how care interacts with authoritarianism, and how in an authoritarian context it is quite hard to develop strong caring institutions. And that leads to a work by the anthropologist Paula Vasquez, who talked about in Venezuela, what we have seen is what she calls compassionate militarism. So it was a military program from the start. Hugo Chavez was obviously a military man, and it was supposedly ideologically guided to take care of the most vulnerable. But from the start, it was completely directed by a military standpoint. And she analyzes interactions between social institutions of care and the military logics that begin to contaminate them. For example, in a natural disaster that happened in Venezuela in 1999. So at the very beginning of Chavismo, she's able to illustrate very clearly how, when someone was trying to technically resolve the situation of natural disaster, instructions from above made it impossible to do the technical abilities and procedures that we're supposed to do. Any critique was awarded off and was silenced because there was not allowance for anything that was interpreted as betrayal, and that began to deteriorate any public system programs to take care of the most vulnerable. And in that sense, there's a very interesting book by a psychologist, Norman Dixon, who worked in the British military, who talks about the psychology of military incompetence, that develops a lot of ideas of what Paula Vasquez described in Venezuela, is how a military standpoint is not compatible with the standpoint you need to be able to run a hospital. And that leads to the pigs at the beginning of my talk. I mean, why were pigs there? Because there were some milicianos, which is like an unofficial military volunteers in Venezuela, who didn't have a place to sleep. And since the hospital was rather abandoned, they gave a space in the hospital to these milicianos. These milicianos raised pigs, so the pigs came along with them. And because there was not many patients, they let the pigs roam through the hospital. But when someone critiqued the situation and made it viral, there was a scandal, and everybody got scared. So this student's protest, that was a logical protest of a situation that kind of escapes any reasonable thinking of what care should be, was thought that it was an inconvenience, that it was wrong for him to voice his protest of pigs being in the hospital because of this military logic, is what I'm getting to. And well, government has been quite insistent in persecuting doctors from the start. This is from this year, an Amnesty International report that shows how government persecution against health workers has been massive, and we have reports leading back to 2004, almost 20 years back, when the Minister of Health threatened doctors that tried to sign a petition against the president at that time, Hugo Chavez, as that was going to be interpreted as an act of terrorism. So we can see here clearly what Paula Vasquez was saying, this interference of military logic in the organization of care, which completely destroyed the possibility to care for the most vulnerable. We have to think, is democracy uh, 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 a health variable? Or do we need democratic spaces to be able to develop modern public health? Well, I think that's a question to leave open, and I'm going to stop here. So, thank you very much for your time and your listening. And if there's anything you want to talk about, I'd be glad to talk about.
Gracias, Manuel. ¿Alguien quiere hacer una pregunta? Any questions? I was thinking what you said at the end through the talk, like psychology requires freedom of speech to be able to operate. Otherwise, it's the build up to the Second World War all over again. In Germany, people could not speak to the therapist because they were required to talk and report back as what he is telling you, etc. There is no option whatsoever to do any kind of talk therapy or anything. So psychology is really at the interface of both worlds, and it's really interesting what you are sharing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think it brings up a good question. I mean, we haven't talked so much about that in psychological literature. I mean, how much something like psychotherapy can only be thought of in a moment of history, in a place where freedom of speech is considered an important value. I mean, is it possible to develop psychotherapy where there is no freedom of speech? And the cases that you mentioned, where authoritarian governments have been in place that start to complicate psychotherapy, and there starts to be anxiety around being able to speak whatever comes to mind, because it can be politically persecuted. For example, we have reports of that in Argentina during the military dictatorships, but also in Hungary and in the Eastern European countries during the Soviet bloc. There's interesting reports of that. So yeah, yeah. I mean, I do think freedom of speech is a indispensable value if we are going to think of psychological attention through psychotherapy.
We have enough expertise of how to revert back from one system that is militaristic and logic, it requires a space code, and anything is justified against that collective or collectives that may just be pointing that there is some mistake, and they have the hierarchical, there is no mistake, we are saying what to do and nobody could say anything else. There is enough literature to help Venezuela go back to a system that can support each other, and please, there is no need to fight against what what is really the enemy here.
Yeah, yeah, sure, sure. Yeah, at the same time, it's in Venezuela, it's been complex because many of the activists and the sources of resistance against human rights abuse are um, are left leaning politics, and I would identify with that progressive thought that leads to trying to attend to inequality and to vulnerability. I think is a very important a strength. But at the same time, Venezuela has been able to cover its authoritarianism with left wing jargon, and that's given them a space to be able to do many of these human rights abuses without many of these activists and organizations that tend to point the finger to human rights abuses, kind of be very tentative and listening to what's going on in Venezuela. And it's been very hard in psychological and psychiatric circles to raise awareness to what has gone on in Venezuela, because many of these organizations tend to be very tentative in looking at Venezuela as a human rights abuser and not as a banner for left wing politics. So that's particular in its own sense. And the other thing that comes up while you were mentioning while you were saying what you were saying is that it's really incredible to see it at work in your university. I mean, in a place where I studied and where I know many of the people who have academic histories and who one knows to be linked to progressive thought and to the thought of freedom of speech, and to think that it's very important to have freedom inside of university, start to react because they're scared and start to have reactions to censor a student. That's kind of surprising to see, and one can see how authoritarian logic begins to take up space.
Yeah, and that links us to the next speaker that I'm waiting for her to connect. She is now in the United Kingdom. She is from the Republic of China. And this is what David shared, that there is legitimate concern despite her being there, because there is no stopping just one person. It is what maybe psychiatry is not doing, is looking at beyond the individual. They are, I mean, these regimes have no stop in just one person. They will go against the closed. And this is something that maybe psychology is much more advanced than psychiatry. Say we need to look at the whole network and the family, the anybody.
Sure, sure, sure. Absolutely. I completely agree. Completely agree with you. I think she's connected now, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, that's correct. Welcome, Jesse. Manuel, do you want to wrap it up, or?
Yeah, well, no, thank you again, Enrique. I mean, it's a interesting to be able to listen to other experiences in other areas. I mean, it was as I told David, it was painful to listen to the atrocity and the massive numbers of abuse that he reported in China. China seems perplexing in many ways, and seems to be for us allows us to think of Venezuela from a different viewpoint. It's they have some parallel logics and some very different at the same time context to kind of mirror and think about different ways of very authoritarian abuse. Yeah, so thank you again for inviting me and to be able to listen to all the other speakers.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to share one anecdote that I have. Uh, and I feel that as researcher, I can at least not be put into question that I am saying what I saw. May she have not been truth, but you will see that a old lady in the street in Barcelona next to the hospital that asked me for money because post-operatory she is left without means to live. That is the psychiatric logic of a diagnosis. It's a beggar, but it's not. It's the psychologically speaking, now you come with a formulation of the case. What she said, it is our lady that is outside the hospital. Afterwards, she could not. And we need this kind of thing that from health system help prevent the massive downfall to a situation like now in Venezuela. Nobody has to, at least the ones in the hospital, do it. So there is a responsibility. But of course, there is fear to talk, but from health disciplines and anybody else around needs to coordinate and help the support system society to stay afloat. It's really something that we should be aware. She's not a beggar. The situations here are not about the enemy or not. It is we need to find a solution.
Yeah, how to attend to the system and not just its consequences. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Jesse, if you wish to start, we can go ahead. Otherwise, I will just say that imagine if in Barcelona we can go ahead and ask and see, trying to delve into China, as hard as it is. A host of David got bullets in the only because it really it makes people think. I hope that it makes people think.
Yeah, yeah. David's presentation is quite astounding. Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Psychologically, the the break from reality that having exposed to this, many people doesn't know that
Yeah,
something that big can.
yeah, it's quite astounding. Yeah, even if I've read a lot of the psychiatric abuse of China, it's been a source for thinking about Venezuela. It's hard to listen to. I mean, I was listening to him, and I felt at I mean, during his presentation, for moments, it is quite uncomfortable, quite disturbing to listen to. So I guess that's part of the challenge of talking about these things. They listening to atrocity is quite hard.
Yeah, well, I want to make the most to apologize that we are only 6 persons. I did my best to promote this event. I will publish, edit, etc. to at least spread the word and make the most of it. Short clips, maybe. Anyhow,
I think it's part of the same thing we're talking about. I mean, first, the rights of mental health has been a difficult issue to put on the table. It's been a struggle to humanize and be able to really register awareness for the rights of psychiatric patients. That by itself has been a challenge, and if you add the political use of psychiatry, it becomes a double difficulty. having to listen to things that we would prefer to think that are impossible, that we would prefer to think that are unimaginable to be happening, is, I think it's quite a challenge. I appreciate your insistence, and I think we need to insist on showing some of these realities, and to network, and to find strength in the networks of people who are aware of what is going on. So yeah, again, I think it is a useful effort, and it's great that you're recording, and we continue to share these ideas.
Yeah, most definitely. Uh, let's take a break, 2 minutes, and then continue with Jesse. Fantastic.